I want to address today a very perplexing statement by our sages in Gemara. This is in the Talmud, Tractate Pesachim, Beseches Pesachim, Kuf Yud Tes Amid Beis, 119b. I should also mention that yesterday many Jews around the world began to learn Meseches Pesachim, and this is close to the end of the tractate, on page 119b, just a few pages before the tractate concludes. And the Gemara says there that when Mashiach comes, Hashem is going to make a big feast. Asid HaKadosh Baruch Hu La'aseh Suda L'Tzadikim B'yom Sheyigamel Chesed L'Zayir Shel Yitzchak. When the Geula comes, Hashem is going to make a great feast for the righteous. And after they eat and drink, we have to benching. For grace after meals, we use a cup of wine, right? We fill up a cup of wine, and we do benching over a cup of wine. So he says, after the meal, they're going to present the Kos Shel Bracha, the cup of blessing, to Avram Avinu, the first Jew. He's going to be at the meal, so that he should lead the benching. And Avram Avinu is going to say, Eini mevarech, I will not make a bracha. Why? Sheyatza mimeni Yishmael. Because Yishmael emerged from me. And Yishmael, as we know, was a child who went his own way. Pera Adam, Yad Bakal, V'yad Kol Bay. Avram Avinu ultimately had to send him away from the home. So therefore Avram Avinu says, and Yishmael's descendants displayed quite intense level of cruelty towards the Jewish people, towards Yitzchak's descendants. Avram refuses to bench, so they offer the cup to Yitzchak. Let Yitzchak hold the cup of blessing and lead the grace after meals, and Yitzchak says, no, I will not do this. Many Esav. Esav came from me. And of course we know that Esav's descendants, including Amalek and Rome, Edom, persecuted the Jews intensely. So they'll come to Yaakov. Tell Yaakov, Hashem tells Yaakov, Toilu Baruch, here, take the cup and bless. Yaakov says, no. You know why? I married two sisters when they were both alive. If one of the sisters would have passed away and then I married the other sister, okay, but I married two sisters when they were alive, and in the future, the Torah is going to prohibit that. One of the prohibitions in Torah when it comes to relationships is to marry two sisters, one sister and then another sister, and even if one divorces the first sister, if the first one is alive, you're not allowed to marry the second sister. And Yaakov Avinu says, I married two sisters before when they were alive, and the Torah is going to prohibit this. And therefore, he's not going to bench. And so they go through the list, and finally, the cup of blessing is given to David HaMelech, and David HaMelech says, Ani avarech v'lina levarech. I will do the blessing, and for me it is appropriate to do the blessings. That's why it says, Kais Yeshuis Etza Uv'Shem Hashem Ekra. And it's here that I want to address this question. Yes, Yaakov Avinu felt that he's not worthy of benching because he married two sisters. Why did he marry two sisters? Why did he marry Leah and Rachel? Let's remember the story in Parshas Vayetzei. Yaakov Avinu escapes his home. Yitzchak sends him to go find a girl in a place called Charan Padan Aram, where his uncle lives, his mother's brother Lavan lives. Lavan has two daughters. The older one is Leah, the younger one is Rachel. Yaakov meets Rachel. He cherishes her, he feels a closeness to her, and he wants to marry her. He asks Lavan to marry her, and Lavan says, no problem, for 7 years of labor, shepherding my flock, you can have Rachel. And we know that after 7 years, what happens? Lavan switches Rachel for Leah. And the night of the wedding, it's not Leah who gets betrothed to Yaakov, but Rachel who gets betrothed to Yaakov. And as the Torah says, Yaakov is intimate with Leah. It's nighttime, he does not see. Vayar ba'boker, sun rises in the morning. V'hinei Leah, it's Leah. He asks Lavan, why did you deceive me? And Lavan says, it's inappropriate in our place. We don't marry over the younger sister before the older sister. But if you want, I'll give you Rachel for another 7 years of labor. You'll have Rachel. And the Torah says Yaakov embraces that reality. He marries Rachel as well, and he works for Lavan another 7 years in lieu of now having Rachel as well. This is the story. Here is the big question. We all know this is a famous principle that our sages taught in many places, and that is that our patriarchs and matriarchs, the Avos and the Imayos, observed the whole Torah even before it was given. The Gemara says this in Yuma, page 28, Yuma Chav Chesed Aleph. Rav says, Kiyam Avram Avinu Kol HaTorah Kula Shalei Nitna. Avram Avinu observed the whole Torah even before it was given, and he brings a pasuk. It says in Parshas told us, Hashem tells Yitzchak, Ekev Asher Shama Avram B'Koili Vayishmar Mishmarti Mitzvot Chukoisei B'Seiroisei. Hashem says, Avram Avinu obeyed my voice, my commandments, and he listened, he internalized, he observed all of my mitzvahs, all of my statutes, all of my laws. And the Gemara says, the Kiyam Avram Avinu Afilu Eruv Tafshilin. Even a mitzvah like Eruv Tafshilin, which is a rabbinic mitzvah, and it allows us to cook on Yom Tov for Shabbos, because usually you're not allowed to cook extra food on Yom Tov that you don't need that day. But through the Eruv Tafshilin that we make you cook, it's a rabbinic injunction. Avram Avinu even observed Eruv Tafshilin. That's why it says mitzvosei chukoisei v'soiroisei in the plural. Not only Torah Shebiksav, but also Torah Shebal Peh. Not only the written Torah, but also the oral tradition. And this is not just, a nice thought. Chazal are saying in reality, the Avos were aware of the mitzvahs of the Torah and they observed them. And that's why the Mefarshim say in Parshas Vayeitzei, when Avram Avinu has the guest that come over to him, he has the 3 guests who later turn out to be angels. And Avram Avinu invites them into his tent. And the Torah says, Vayikach chema v'chalav uven habakar asher asa. And the Mefarshim say, look at the order. He gives them chema, which is yogurt, or sour cream, or butter, and he gives them milk. And then uben habakar asher asa, and then he prepares the meat. And the Mefarshim say that Avram Avinu was makbid. He made sure to first give them milchiks, dairy, and only afterwards give them deli. Because if he would have first given them meat, they would have to wait a long time until they can eat milk. But after you eat milk, you don't have to wait so long until you eat meat. And that's why there's the order of how he served even his guests, which appeared to be Bedouin Arabs. Yaakov Avinu himself says this about himself as well. Yaakov Avinu himself says in Parshas Vayishlach, he sends a message to Esav, and he tells Esav, Im Lavan Garti, I have lived with Lavan. And Rashi says right there, Garti is Taf Reish Yud Gimel. It's 4 letters, Taf Reish, which means 613. Im Lavan Garti v'taryag mitzvahs shamarti. I lived with Lavan, but I observed the 630 mitzvahs of the Torah. Of course, some of the mitzvahs could not be observed then the way they were observed later, but whatever mitzvah can be observed, they observed, and each mitzvah they observed in some form or fashion. The Zohar discusses how Yaakov put on tefillin. His whole avodah with the sticks by Lavan, with the sheep, was a form of putting on tefillin, etc. But the concept is, because obviously they didn't have tefillin with parchments, with the sections of Torah that we have in our tefillin, or a mezuzah on the door with sections of Torah wasn't written yet. But the reality, the energy of every mitzvah was observed by the Avos and the Imayos. And as we said, even Erev Tafshilin. We have a Rashi about Yitzchak as well. Yitzchak sends Esav to bring him food, so he says, Sana kelecha. Rashi says Yitzchak was telling Esav that he should sharpen the knife to make sure that there's no blemish in the knife. Shaloi tachileni nevela. When you shecht an animal, it should be sure that to be a kosher animal. The shechita, the slaughtering, has to be done with a smooth knife, so it shouldn't turn out to be a non-kosher shechita, a non-kosher form of slaughtering, which makes the animal non-kosher. And therefore, even if you get a kosher animal like a deer, but it has to be shechted in an appropriate way. But this was before Matan Torah. The Avos were not abdim. Nobody was given the mitzvahs yet. They only had the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, the 7 Noachide laws. Nonetheless, the Avos were meticulous to observe the mitzvahs. This is now the problem. How is it that Yaakov could tell Lavan? And Rashi says, "V'taryag mitzvahs shamarti." I observed the 630 mitzvahs. You did not observe the 630 mitzvahs. Go to Vayikra, Perik Yud Ches, Pasuk Yud Ches, Leviticus chapter 18, verse 18. It says, "V'isha el achaisa lo yisikach." You cannot marry a woman and then her sister. You cannot marry 2 sisters. Litzrar legalois ervasa la b'chaya. You cannot marry one sister if you marry the other sister, as long as the first sister is alive, even if you're not married anymore. You're not allowed to now marry the second sister. And the Torah uses on the word litzrar. You're causing the 2 sisters to become enemies, to become a tzara, to become a source of distress for each other. Because the fact is, the Sefer HaChinuch writes, Mitzvah Reish Zayin, Lo Yisa Adam Shtei Achayos. There's a prohibition. A person is not allowed to marry 2 sisters. It's one of the 613 mitzvahs of Torah. And the Torah uses the word litzro shaloi sasa sa'achas tzara lechaverta. Sisters have a special relationship. Everybody who has sisters knows it's a healthy, functional family. There's a special kinship between sisters that is unique. Even though brothers also have a special relationship, and parents and children have a special relationship, but there's something about sisters, right? Those of you who have sisters, you know what I'm talking about. There's something special about the bond, the kinship between sisters. There's the closeness, the trust, growing up in the same home. There's something very special about sisters. Now, we are interfering into this relationship. When a person marries two sisters and now they're both wives of this person, even in a time when they did polygamy before Chaim Rabbeinu Gershom, the Torah prohibits this. Do not do this to sisters. Don't bring them into a marriage with one husband. You are undermining a very powerful relationship between two sisters. So how does Yaakov tell Lavan, I observed the 613 mitzvahs? You did not. You did not. Now you might say, well, he was duped. He was deceived. What is he supposed to do? Well, one second. Nobody forced him to marry Rachel. He wanted to marry Rachel. He was deceived. Okay? He got married to Leah. Okay, now what happens? Morning comes, he's married to Leah. You say, well, he wanted Rachel. Okay, I understand he wanted Rachel. But he was married to Leah. Now, he couldn't divorce Leah because even if you divorce Leah, you're still not allowed to marry a sister. As I told you, as long as one sister is alive, you're not allowed to marry the second sister. He couldn't kill Leah. It was just a joke, of course not. So there was no options. He can divorce Leah and not be married to Leah or Rachel, or he could be married to Leah and not marry Rachel. But Yaakov Avinu clearly engages in something that in the future will be a violation of Jewish law. How do we reconcile this with that principle? How can the sages say the others observed the whole Torah before it was given? They did not. At least Yaakov Avinu did not. We have a clear story in Chumash undermining it. And it's strange because Rashi himself brings the medrash that Yaakov said, I observed the 613 mitzvahs when I was by Lavan. You did not observe the 613 mitzvahs. And the Gemara in Pesachim says, you yourself will not want to take the cup of benching of grace after meals. Why? Because I did something that in the future will become prohibited, and therefore I feel that I'm unworthy of taking the kosher bracha. The Ramban asks this question. Nachmanides, who lived in the 13th century in Spain, Barcelona, Rabbeinu Moshe ben Nachman, in his commentary on Chumash, Perik Chavav Bereshis Pasuk, Genesis 26, says, since Avram observed the whole Torah, and this was the custom of the patriarchs, Eich yesh lishel eich nasa Yaakov shtei achayos. There's a great question, how could Yaakov marry two sisters and violate this principle that the Avos observed the whole Torah? Again, if Yaakov wouldn't have this commitment to observe the whole Torah, it's not a question. Before the Torah was given, it was not forbidden. You can marry a sister, and you can marry another sister. But since the Avos observed the Torah before it was given, how can Yaakov do this? Why? And why would he do it? We all know the Ramban's answer, or at least many of us remember the Ramban's answer. What's the Ramban's answer? The Ramban says something very interesting. The patriarchs and the matriarchs were only careful to observe the Torah when they were living in the borders of Eretz Yisrael. Once they went out of Eretz Yisrael, they were not meticulous anymore to observe the whole Torah. And this is how the Rambam explains something painful. He says, where was the marriage of Yaakov Avinu? The marriage of Yaakov Avinu was in Mesopotamia and Haran, northern Iraq, southern Turkey, that region of the world outside of Eretz Yisrael. Over there, Yaakov did not observe the whole Torah, and therefore over there he could marry two sisters. He could marry Leah, and then he could marry Rachel. He says, however, when he came back to Eretz Yisrael, indeed what happens? Rachel passes away. In Eretz Yisrael, he couldn't observe the whole Torah. In Eretz Yisrael, he observed the whole Torah. And in Eretz Yisrael, indeed, he didn't have to divorce Leah anymore. Rachel Imenu passed away. And Rachel Imenu passed away, so he wasn't married anymore to two sisters. Somebody says one of the reasons that Rachel wasn't buried in Maris Machpelah, because since Rachel married him, Leah, he was married to in a permissible way, because Leah, when he married Leah, she was the only woman. But Rachel was the one who was added later as a sister, so the problem was with Rachel, not with Leah. He didn't want to be buried with two sisters, because this would be problematic, because of the prohibition later. So this is the Ramban's explanation. A very interesting explanation. There's a difference between in Eretz Yisrael and outside of Eretz Yisrael. which is actually consistent with the view of the Ramban. The Ramban says that the main observance of all the mitzvahs is only in Eretz Yisrael. The Sifri says, we say in V'hayim Shema, the second part of Shema, you're going to be expelled from the good land, from Eretz Yisrael. But still, even in the diaspora, you should still observe mitzvahs. So Rashi brings from the Sifri on the Pasuk Hatzivi L'Chatziyunim that the mitzvahs that we do in Chutz La'aretz are essentially a preparation for the mitzvahs that we do in Eretz Yisrael. The Ramban holds that the main observance of Torah and mitzvahs of Yiddishkeit is in Eretz Yisrael. The reason we do the mitzvahs in Chutz La'aretz is that when we come back to Eretz Yisrael, we should know what to do. We should know how a Jew lives. In other words, Eretz Yisrael is the organic home of the Jew. That's where Judaism can live. That's where the Jew can fully breathe. That's where the Jew can fully express his or her identity and live in an organic fashion, connected to the soil, connected to the earth. This is where Jewish life can be lived to the fullest. It can be actualized and materialized in the most powerful way. This is what the Ramban explains in Vayikra. And therefore, in Eretz Yisrael, the Avos observed the whole Torah before was given, but not in Chutz La'aretz. The reason we observe the mitzvahs in Chutz La'aretz is as a sign to remember the mitzvahs. We shouldn't forget them where in Chutz La'aretz. The Ramban is not trying to be lenient about observing the mitzvahs outside of Eretz Yisrael, but the Ramban is saying that the ultimate fulfillment of Torah and mitzvahs is in Eretz Yisrael. This follows the Ramban's view also about Yaakov Avinu. However, even though this is a very interesting answer of the Ramban, nonetheless, according to Rashi, you can't give this answer. And according to many Midrashim, you can't give this answer, because what did Yaakov tell Lavan? Remember, Im Lavan garti, v'taryag mitzvahs shamarti. Rashi clearly says that Yaakov announced, he sent a message to Esav, when he left Lavan's house in Chutz La'aretz, I observed the 630 mitzvahs. In other words, even by Lavan, v'taryag mitzvahs. He doesn't say 612, he says 630 mitzvahs. How could you say such a thing, Yaakov? According to the Ramban, that wouldn't make sense. He did not observe the Taryag mitzvahs by Lavan. So how can the Ramban say this? So it's an explanation of the Ramban, but certainly according to Rashi and many Midrashim, this explanation would not suffice. There's another famous answer that was given by a great sage, is known as Rabbi Yehuda Ruzanis. He authored the commentary of Mishnah Lamelech on the Rambam. And he has a book known as Parashas Drachim. Parashas Drachim. And over there, the Mishnah Lamelech, Rabbi Yehuda Ruzanis, he addresses this in a different way. He says, I want to ask you a question. The patriarchs and the matriarchs of Israel, were they considered Jews or Gentiles? Certainly they were monotheists. Certainly they had a special intimate relationship with Hashem. But are they considered Bnei Noach or are they considered Jews? It's before the Torah was given. Torah and mitzvahs were not given. What is their halachic status? Do we say that essentially they were Gentiles? It's just they observed various mitzvahs and various stringencies and various commandments, or they had the definition, halachic definition of Jews. Says the Parashas Drachim, if you say that they were actually defined as Jews, just like after Matan Torah, we have in halacha, there's the status of a Jew and the status of a Gentile. Each one has its unique mitzvahs and its unique role in the world. Before Matan Torah, there was also this difference. If so, you could say that Rachel and Leah were converted. They converted to Judaism. They converted to the lifestyle, to the faith of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. We know conversion has a unique halach. The Gemara says, Gershin is gair kekatan shanay ladami. A convert who converts is like a child that was reborn. It's like a second birth. It's a new birth. And therefore, halachically, he could marry Rachel and Leah, because halachically they're not considered sisters, even though biologically they're sisters. But because they both went through a conversion. And if they went through a conversion, it's kekatan shanay ladami. It's like a new birth. So Rachel is reborn. Leah is reborn, not to the same father and mother, because it's like a new spiritual birth, and they become new people. And this is a fascinating idea, because basically what it means is that when a ger converts, even though biologically family always remains family, and you never sever that, and obviously there's certain feelings and emotions, but actually halachically, the ger, the convert, Rachel is allowed to marry a husband, who's married to her sister, because they're not considered halachic sisters. It's like two children who were reborn anew. They were reborn anew. In fact, a convert, halachically, can even marry his own sister. If she converts, why? Because they're not siblings. Now, the rabbi said you shouldn't do it because we shouldn't say that when you're a non-Jew, you don't marry your sister. When you become a Jew, you go mikdusha chamur, likdusha kali, you marry your sister. So rabbinically, you're not allowed to. A ger doesn't marry his sister, doesn't marry his mother if she converts, right? But here you have a situation of two sisters, a husband marrying two sisters. Since these two sisters, so this is not something that's changing from they were Gentiles, that they were on a higher level of Kedusha, and now you're lowering it, so it wouldn't be a problem. So therefore, Yaakov could marry two sisters, because halachically they're not considered sisters. But there's a difficulty here, even though it's a very interesting answer. If the reason why you're not allowed to marry two sisters is litzra, because you're interfering in the relationship between them, it's causing a distress, it's making one a source of distress for the other, conversion doesn't change the biological sense of connectivity. And to say that before Matan Torah conversion can achieve such a thing, it's difficult to say. What is more, Hashem tells Avram Avinu in Parshas Lech Lecha, "Va'ata tovel avosecha b'shalom." You're going to come back to your fathers peacefully. So Rashi says that Hashem told him that Terach is going to do tshuva. According to the Parashas Drachim, Avram Avinu is not even the child of Terach, because Avram Avinu certainly converted to Judaism. So biologically he's a child, but not spiritually. Why does Hashem say, "Va'ata tovel avosecha b'shalom"? You're going to come back to your father and you're going to be united with him peacefully. And Rashi explains this. That means, according to Rashi, you can't say there was just a conversion and he's not connected to Terach anymore. The Torah clearly says Hashem calls Terach his father. So if so, you have to say that the conversion before Matan Torah, even if there was a form of conversion, it's not the same conversion like after Matan Torah. It's a different status. Even if you're calling them Jews and there's a concept of conversion, it's not the same conversion like after Matan Torah to say that Rachel and Leah are not considered sisters anymore. And if so, at least according to Rashi, we're left with this great question. Why is it that Yaakov Avinu violates this great commitment of the patriarchs and matriarchs to observe the whole Torah before it was given? I'm going to present today a fascinating explanation that was presented by the Lubavitcher Rebbe at a Farbrengen. It was Shabbos Parshas Vayeitzei. Shabbos Parshas Miketz Tavshin Chav Ches. That's the beginning of 1968, Shabbos Miketz. And there, the Lubavitcher Rebbe suggested another way of looking at this, and actually very simple, very straightforward, which would even make sense according to Rashi. Because Rashi himself says that Yaakov observed all the 630 mitzvahs even outside of the diaspora, and yet Rashi, who says, Ani basi l'farish pshudah shel mikra, I'm here to explain everything in Chumash that's difficult, should have given an answer to somebody learning Chumash. So why did he marry two sisters? So obviously Rashi felt that there's something very straightforward and simple. Why, a simple explanation why Yaakov could marry two sisters. And the explanation that the Lubavitcher Rebbe presented is actually brilliant in its simplicity. Yaakov Avinu could not get out of marrying Rachel. You know why? He made a promise to her. He made a commitment to Rachel that he's going to marry her. And she waited 7 years. The Pasuk says in Parshas Vayetzei, what happens? Pasuk says in Parshas Vayetzei, Yaakov Avinu meets Rachel at the well. When he ran away from his house and he came to Charan, he meets Rachel at the well. The Torah says over there, he kisses her, he raises his voice, he weeps, she tells him who she is. What does Yaakov do? It says Yaakov loves Rachel, and he tells Lavan, I will serve you 7 years in order for me to be allowed to marry Rachel. And Lavan agrees. He says, much better to marry her off to you than to give her to anybody else. And Yaakov does this for 7 years, and those years pass like a few days because he loves her so much. This was a commitment. And Rachel knew about this commitment. It's not like Rachel was hiding somewhere in a forest. Rachel knew that here's Lavan, here's Yaakov, he's working 7 years, he's going to marry her. They already met, they connected 7 years ago. Yaakov displayed his affection to her. He made a promise, and at the end of the 7 years, he tells Lavan, the time is up, I want to be with her. And that's when Lavan makes the switch. So Yaakov made a commitment to Rachel that he is going to marry her. So now you're going to say, Yaakov should tell Rachel, I'm so sorry, I would love to, but the circumstances changed. Your father gave me your sister, and because your father gave me your sister, so therefore, I can't marry you. He can't do this. You know why? He made a promise to her. So you'll say, well, excuse me. If somebody made a promise to a woman to marry her, but then he ends up marrying the sister, well, he can't just marry 2 sisters because he told her he's going to marry her. There's a prohibition in the Torah that you're not allowed to marry 2 sisters. I told you I'm going to eat pork tomorrow. I can't eat pork. I'm not allowed to. So what do you mean? So Yaakov should tell Rachel that. I'm sorry, I can't. But here's the catch. We'll say it in Yiddish. Yaakov could be machmer on his own cheshbon, nicht auf an ander cheshbon. Yaakov could be stringent when it comes to his own Judaism, not when it comes to somebody else's life. Remember, Hashem did not obligate Yaakov to observe the 630 mitzvahs. This was a personal chumrah, a personal stringency that the Avos accepted upon themselves to do an extracurricular activity beyond what was obliged, beyond the law. Lifnim mishur sadin, gesundheit. You could be as stringent as you want for yourself, but you cannot allow your own chumrah to come at the expense of the promise you made to another person. The commitment to Rachel was a real commitment. It was a real promise. And according even to the laws of Bnei Noach before Matan Torah, a commitment you have to fulfill. My proof is, Yaakov tells Lavan, Lama rimi sani, why did you deceive me? Lavan should have said, what's the problem with deceiving somebody? I told you that I'll give you Rachel. I changed my mind. They say there was an Israeli politician who once made a promise, and then he didn't fulfill his promise. So they came to him and they said, you promised, harei iftachta. And he says, iftachti, avalo iftachti lekayem. I made a promise, but I didn't make a promise to do it. It was a promise. Lavan should have told Yaakov, why did I deceive you? Why not? Where does it say you can't deceive somebody? I told you that I'll give you Rachel. I decided I want to give you Leah. He didn't do that. He had to justify himself. Why did he have to justify himself? This means that even in the culture of the Bnei Noach, of the Gentile world, deceiving somebody, meaning making a promise with words, a commitment, and then backing out, even though you can do it, but you're backing out on it, you're violating the promise, it was considered immoral before Matan Torah. So the chumrah of Yaakov Avinu can't come at the price of violating a promise you made to somebody. If it was after Matan Torah and I made a promise to somebody, I tell a girl, I'm going to marry you, and then I end up marrying her sister for whatever reason, right or wrong. Now I can't marry her because I am forbidden to do this. I am forbidden to marry 2 sisters. It's not a chumrah, it's a prohibition. Hashem doesn't allow a Jew to marry 2 sisters. Yes, it's painful, I should apologize, I made a commitment, but there's nothing to do, I'm so sorry. But for Yaakov Avinu, there was no prohibition to marry 2 sisters. It was a chumrah, beautiful chumrah, an amazing chumrah. The Avis did the whole Torah before it was given. They observed all the 613 mitzvahs, but at whose expense? You're going to do it at Rachel's expense? You're going to hurt Rachel? You're going to shame Rachel? You're going to make Rachel miserable? Rachel was waiting 7 years for this. You made a commitment. At whose expense are you going to be a tzaddik? At whose expense are you going to be a holy Jew? You'll be holy. I observed the whole Torah before it was given, and Rachel is left lonely. Rachel is left sad. Rachel is left dejected, bereft of this relationship she was looking forward to. Now you might say, okay, so divorce Leah. Divorce Leah and marry Rachel. You could do both. You made a promise to Rachel, you didn't make a promise to Leah. So besides the fact of what it would do to Leah, there's also another issue. Divorcing Leah wouldn't help. Because even if you divorce Leah, you're still not allowed to marry Rachel. As I told you, as long as one sister is alive, you're not allowed to marry the second sister. So divorcing Leah would not be a solution to this halachic quandary. The only solution would be not to marry Rachel. Why? Because you do the whole Torah. The Torah says you're not allowed to marry two sisters. Wait, beautiful. But that's a chumrah. It's my own stringency. I can't allow my chumrah to be more powerful than my obligation to fulfill my word. And we see that even before Matan Torah, this was considered a moral obligation. And that's why Lavan had to justify himself and explain why he deceived Yaakov. And he said, I had no choice because marrying off a younger sister before an older sister is completely inappropriate in our space. We see later also, it comes to Shimon and Levi. When Shimon and Levi kill out the whole city of Shechem, Yaakov tells them, Achartem oisi lahavisheni b'yoshev haaretz. You have made me disgusting. You have made me ugly. You have made me perceive grotesque. You have made me look very ugly, very immoral. And you have made me stink in the eyes of the citizens of the country. Why? Why? There was a war. They were trying to save Dinah. The problem is they made a covenant and they violated it. Shem and Chamar came to the Shvatim, and they said, let's make a treaty. We will live with you, you will live with us, we will be in peace, we will intermarry with each other, we will do business together. And you agreed, and you made a condition. If they circumcised themselves, that's fine. And they went to the city and everybody circumcised themselves. In other words, there was a covenant. There was a treaty that was made, verbally a commitment. And what happened? You destroyed this. You manipulated them. You exploited their weakness the third day of the circumcision, and you went to kill them. The question was not if Shimon and Levi had a reason. They wanted this. Dinah was abducted, by the way. Dinah was never released. He raped Dinah and he kept her in the palace. And they went to save Dinah. But we're not getting into the details of that story, what Shimon and Levi exactly were thinking. But Yaakov Avinu was so perturbed. Shimon and Levi could have turned to Yaakov and say, Rabbi Yaakov, why is everybody going to be upset at you? Yaakov said that all the nations, all the people in these Yoshvei, everybody that lives in the land is going to see me as a disgusting person, as a achartemaisi. Why? Because you violated a commitment. So we see from here that a commitment was considered valid, intense, potent and powerful. Even by the Bnei Noach, it was considered immoral. It was objectionable. It was reprehensible if you do not follow through with your commitment. So Yaakov says, I have a chumrah to observe the whole Torah, beautiful, but I made a commitment to Rachel. What's more powerful? Violating a commitment was considered a prohibition as an extension of the Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei Noach, a violation of moral life. Not marrying two sisters is a Torah prohibition for the future. For me, to tell Rachel I'm not going to marry her and cause her such pain and violate the promise, this cannot be dismissed because of my desire to be a mahadir, to be a machmir, to be stringent in Torah. I'm going to quote the words of the Rebbe and translate. He says, the fact that the Avos accepted upon themselves to observe the whole Torah, it was a chumrah. It was a hisofa in frumkeit mitzad ha'avos. The Avos decided they want to be more frum, and that's why it's a special schus. It's a unique schus. So when the observance of a certain mitzvah that you were not commanded is going to be in contradiction to a mitzvah for which you were commanded, you cannot do that mitzvah, because obviously a chumrah cannot override a commandment. The Avos were not obligated to do all the mitzvahs. This was a special stringency. If this is now contradicting something they were commanded, and they're going to say, whoa, I can't do this mitzvah, I have to observe the whole Torah. A chumrah cannot override a mitzvah, or to put it in different words. In this situation, when by fulfilling the whole Torah, you're going to violate a mitzvah that you do have, then how can you observe the whole Torah? By not doing it, because it's contradicting a mitzvah that you were given. Which explains brilliantly and simply a very big question. If Avram did the whole Torah before it was given, why didn't he circumcise himself? At age 99, he circumcised him. When Hashem tells him, he said Avram did the Torah even before that. So why didn't he give himself a bris? He did the whole Torah before it was given. What's the answer? The answer is Pashat. One of the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach is, you're not allowed to spill your own blood. It says in Parshas Noach, V'ach es damchem lenafshei seichem edrish. Rashi says, Hashoifech dam atzmai. If you spill your own blood, not only if you kill yourself, even if you just hurt yourself, you maim yourself, and you spill your own blood, even if it's not life-threatening, it is forbidden. That's what it says in Parshas Noach. You're not allowed to make yourself ill. You're not allowed to spill your own blood. We're not talking about bloodletting in order to make you healthier. We're talking about spilling blood, not to make you healthier. So how can Avram Avinu circumcise himself? You say, because Avram Avinu is very, very frum. You can't be frum on the cheshbon of Hashem. Hashem says you're not allowed to spill your own blood. When you circumcise yourself, you're spilling your own blood. He didn't need it for health. So you say, but I have to observe the whole Torah. Wait, you're observing the whole Torah and violating what Hashem told you? Because you want to be a machmir, therefore you're going to violate the mitzvah of Hashem. Hashem told you not to spill your own blood. You can't. When Hashem gives you a mitzvah to do a bris milah, then you have to. Because the same God who told you not to spill your own blood told you to do a bris milah. So then it's a mitzvah. But to do the mitzvah of bris milah on your own is not frum. You're not being frum, you're violating Torah, because Torah said you shouldn't. The same point here. Yaakov Avinu wants to be frum, not to marry two sisters. But 1 second, not marrying Rachel is violating violating the mitzvah to fulfill your promises and your commitments, which was something that was valid before Matan Torah. So in order to be frum and observe Torah, what does Yaakov Avinu do? He has to marry two sisters. He has to marry two sisters, because if he doesn't marry two sisters, he's actually violating a mitzvah that he's obligated to do. You can't allow a chumrah to override a mitzvah. In this case, what's the chumrah? The chumrah is not to do the chumrah. In this case, the chumrah is not to do the chumrah. That's how you're stringent. Sometimes you do a chumrah by not doing it, by going out of your chumras, because if you do the chumrah, you're violating a mitzvah. It's a great story. It's a story about the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Rebbe Rayatz. You know that by Chassidim, they're very makbid on shruya, gebrakts. So they say that once in the home of the Rebbe Rayatz, second floor of 770 Eastern Parkway, he was having it was a Pesach Fabrengen, or Pesach meal, and there was somebody there who wasn't a chassid, and he took the matzah and he dipped it into vinaigrette, into beet sauce, into beets, vinaigrette it's called. It was like a beet mixture. He dipped in the matzah. He was at the end of the table, the other end of the table. So there were yeshiva boys there, Chabadniks. They got very perturbed, because by Chassidim and by Chabad, they're very, very meticulous about not getting your matzah wet, not only with water, with any liquid, including with beets. So they were very, they were very triggered. And I guess they gave this person a piece in their mind. Either they rebuked him or screamed at him, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" The Rebbe, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Jacobson, was at the other end of the table. And he saw that there was a commotion, so he asked Reb Shmuel Levitin, what is going on there? One of his chassidim, what's going on? So he said, he'll find out, and he asks. And they tell him that this person had the audacity to take matzah and dip it into the beet. So the Rebbe said, Beser aroitem matzah v'aroitem ponim. Better a red matzah than a red face. Because you're machmir not to eat gebrakts, therefore you're going to humiliate somebody and embarrass them and cause them to blush. Better a red matzah than a red face. The Rebbe was not saying that matzah shruya is not an important chumrah. His grandfather, the Balatanya, says to be very careful not to eat gebrakts, with the reasons that he gives. And he explains how the baking of the matzah changed in the 1700s, and because the whole process of baking changed, and the bakeries changed, and there was a concept of bakeries, therefore now it is not uncommon that there should be a speck of flour that is unbaked because of how fast they bake the matzah in the oven with so much intense heat, and there could be a speck of dough that's unbaked, and if it gets wet, chas v'shalom, it could be chametz. He has a whole tshuva about it. But even he says, Achron shel Pesach, you could eat matzah shruya, because it's a chumrah, it's a stringency, and an important one. And that's why by Chassidim they're very meticulous about it. But you have to know the difference between a chumrah, a minhig, a mitzvah's essay, a mitzvah's loises, something that's asim in atayra, asim in the rabbanon, a minhig and a chumrah. So now I'm going to embarrass somebody publicly and make them blush and make them feel horrible, so that what? That I can observe my chumrah. No, you missed the boat. We don't observe chumras because we want to be holier than thou. We observe chumras because we want to be close to truth, because we want to be close to God, because we want a relationship with Hashem. If Hashem says you're going to be embarrassing somebody, now the chumrah is, let him eat gebrakts. I'll tell you another beautiful story talking about Pesach. I told you that a lot of people started to learn Maseches Pesachim now for Daf Yomi. In 1979, there was the revolution in Iran. I don't know if some of you probably remember it. Right, the Shah was overthrown in 1979. You remember, and Ayatollah Khomeini came to power. And everything changed in Iran from then till this very day, all the tsaras of Iran. There were many, many Jews living in Iran at the time. A few months before the revolution, it's a whole story in and of itself, but I remember it as a child, the Lubavitcher Rebbe sent some emissaries to Iran to convince parents to send their children to come study in the States or in Israel. And a few thousand youth of Iran came out then. I still remember they came to Brooklyn, they were set up in different places, they were set up in yeshivas, and there are hundreds and hundreds of families today from those kids who left Iran then. And it was Pesach 79. And I remember in Crown Heights, they made a huge Seder for the Iranian children. And the Rebbe, the night of Pesach, came to visit them before the Seder, to speak to the children, to encourage them, sing with them, celebrate Pesach with them before he went home to do his own Seder. A few days before Pesach, the Rebbe sent a message to the Lubavitcher Rebbe sent a message to the organizers. They should make sure to prepare rice for these children, for the Pesach Dika Seder and for the Pesach Dika meals. And those who received the instruction were very perturbed. They're Ashkenazim. They come from Russia, Ashkenazim. And we all know Ashkenazim, rice on Pesach. Are you crazy? It's kitnius. It's kitnius. It was so strange. But then they realized these are kids from Iran. By them, rice is a staple food on Pesach. These kids left their parents. They're young. They're alone, they're lonely, they're vulnerable. For them, part of Pesach celebration is they eat rice. Do we eat rice? We don't eat rice. Is it forbidden to eat rice? Is it a biblical prohibition, a rabbinic prohibition? In Gemara, it's not. It's the Isser of Kitnias that was introduced by the Ashkenazic halachic authorities in the Middle Ages, whether the 10th century, 11th century, 12th century, somewhere in that zip code. It's a chumrah, it's a minhig, it's an isser that's brought in later poskim. Is it a biblical prohibition? No. Is it a rabbinic prohibition from the early Chaim? No. And that's why the Sfardim do it. The Ashkenazim don't do it, the Sfardim do it. These are kids that from Sfardim, kids from Iran. For them, this was part of Pesach. We're going to cook rice on Pesach. The Rebbe was saying, it's a chumrah. It's a chumrah that we cherish. It's a chumrah that we keep. But don't take away their Pesach. Don't interfere with their Pesach. They are in a vulnerable place, and this is going to add to their Simchas Yom Tov, and Simchas Yom Tov is a mitzvah min HaTorah. And if I know that by not making rice, I'm going to be observing my chumrah, but ultimately it's going to take away Pesach from them. The Rebbe says, make that for them rice. I thought it's a simple story, such a beautiful story. It's about an approach. And this should not come from lightheadedness. Sometimes people couldn't care less, hachumra, minne, kitniyas, no kitniyas. That's not where it's coming from. We're talking here about people, their commitment. You had to see how the Rebbe ate matzah with and he was careful from gebrakts or careful from kitniyas. On themselves, they were makbid at koitzer shel yud. If it's a chumra, if it's a minig Yisrael Torah, they were very makbid. But you have to understand, you have to have perspective, you have to have a bird's eye view. Don't get caught up in the religious, obsessiveness and holier than thou attitude, and it often becomes about ego. And even if it's not about ego, it becomes about my chumras at the expense of others. They say a beautiful story about the Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim once came home, he had guests, and he right away went to Kiddush. He skipped Shalom Aleichem, he skipped Eishes Chayil, right away to Kiddush. Later, middle of the meal, he did Shalom Aleichem, he did Eishes Chayil. So somebody asked him, his wife or somebody asked him, what happened? And he said, I saw that the guests were very hungry. They didn't eat anything all day. Maybe they didn't eat the night before, the day before. They were poor people, they were hungry. And they were starving. And I felt the most important thing is to feed them. And then he said, the Malachim, they are not hungry, they can't warten. The Malachim are not starving. They can wait. The Gemara says, the Malachim of Avram Avinu, it looked like they ate. They didn't eat. They're not starving. He says, they can't warten. The Malachim will wait a little longer. What do you mean? Shalom Aleichem, you do before Kiddush. Well, Chafetz Chaim said, wait. You have a Jew who's hungry, you have to feed him. We have to say Shalom Aleichem. It's a minhag to say Shalom Aleichem, a gevaldik minhag. I'll say it later. They say a story about Rebbe Yaakov Kaminetzky. Zatzal Rashiv of Torah V'das, from Slobodka. It's a matzah I heard from one of his family members, or talmudim, I think. He didn't eat gebrakts on Pesach. Now, he was a Litvak. The Chassidim are makbid on gebrakts because of the true of the Balatanya and other poskim in the Chassidic world. The Litvish Yidden did eat gebrakts. They were not makbid on Shroya. He was a Slobodka Talmud. So somebody asked him, I think his Einikel, why he doesn't eat gebrakts. And he responded, and he said something. He said, he was in Slobodka in Yeshiva in Lithuania. He couldn't go home for Pesach, he didn't have money. So they set him up with a family there. It was called Essen Tag. They set him up with a family there. He should eat to have the Seder there. They served the chicken soup for the Seder with kneidlach, matzah ball soup. Of course, kneidlach gebrakts. You take matzah, right? You grind the matzah, right, into small pieces. You have small pieces of matzah, like flour, so to speak, and then you knead it with water and you make kneidlach. So it's essentially gebrakts. You take matzah, you make it wet. Rabbi Yaakov had a question on the kashrus of the chicken. And their chicken was the chicken soup. He had but he felt uncomfortable to say, I'm not sure this chicken is good, whatever his question was. So what did he do? He said, the kneidlach were in the soup. He said, I don't need gebrakts. I don't need it. It already was a minhag that people knew about. So therefore he didn't need it. He'll eat matzah for the meal if they had some vegetables, whatever he ate. I don't know what they had. I don't know if they had anything else. So he said because he told them that he doesn't eat gebrakts, for the rest of his life, he never ate gebrakts. Even though his minhag would have been to eat gebrakts, he came from a Litvisher family. He was a Litvisher Yid. Because he told them verbally, I do not eat gebrakts, this is my custom, it became his custom. He never ate gebrakts again. The power of words, the power of commitment, and the power of understanding, prioritizing. Chumras are gevaldik, menhagam are gevaldik. The others observe the whole Torah, moidedik. But wait, if Hashem tells you to do something, and because of you observing the whole Torah, you're not going to do what Hashem tells you to do. No. Now the chumrah is to violate the chumrah and do what Hashem does. So Avram Avinu can't do a bris milah. How can he do a bris milah? You're spilling your own blood. Hashem tells you to do a bris. You do a bris. Till Hashem tells you to do a bris, you can't do a bris. There's something else we see in Bereshis. Another fascinating thing. We see that Yaakov was punished because he didn't respect his parents for 22 years. He was away from his parents. He left Yitzchak, he left Rivka, even though he had to leave, and he stayed away from home 22 years. Which was lacking. It was a lack in his kibud avayim, in his showing respect of his father and mother. 1 second. Where was there a mitzvah to respect his father and mother? Mitzvah's kibud avayim was not given then. What do we see from this? We see from this that this was an obligation even before Matan Torah. Even the Bnei Noach accepted this upon themselves. The human mitzvah, the human idea, the humanistic idea of respecting your parents was ingrained even in the culture of Bnei Noach. That's why it says, the Torah says that Terach died in Haran before Avram Avinu left. So Rashi says, 1 second. Avram Avinu left years after Terach died, so that the world should not say that Avram Avinu neglected his father and did not observe Kibud Av. We did have to observe Kibud Av. The pshat is, these were moral obligations that were ingrained in the psyche of the Bnei Noach even before Matan Torah, to the point that people held themselves and each other responsible for this. And by Yaakov Avinu not being careful about Kibud Av V'Eim, this affected him. And therefore, Yaakov, one of the moral obligations even before Matan Torah of Bnei Noach was the verbal commitments that you make, you have to keep. I'll say, spilling your own blood, Hashem says clearly not to do it. But where does Hashem say not to fool people, not to deceive people, not to violate commitments? But the fact is that these were things apparently that the Bnei Noach accepted upon themselves. Rashi says in Vayishlach that the Ummos, after the Mabul, accepted certain promiscuous arayas. They would not engage in these relationships. And that's why the Torah doesn't want to say that Avram violated Kibud Av. What's the problem of Kibud Av? This was something that the world respected. And if you don't do Kibud Av, it's a problem. And because of that, it got a certain moral toikef, a moral strength, according to Dinei Bnei Noach and according to Torah. This became the moral obligation. So if the Avos, by doing their own chumrah, would undermine something moral that all the Bnei Noach were doing, then the right thing to do is not to do your chumrah. It would be a chilul Hashem to do your chumrah, and it would be violating the moral code of the Bnei Noach that everybody accepted upon themselves. Because obviously, something that became the norm of morality among all the Bnei Noach, like not deceiving somebody else, is more important than your own chumrah. And one of the things obviously was, just we spoke about Kibud Avim, it's not deceiving somebody else. So Yaakov promised Rachel to marry her. Not only did he promise her, he gave her simonim, right? We know that he gave her simonim because she told him that my father is a deceiver. So he gave her simonim, which means Rachel knew that what? That Yaakov is going to marry her. For him not to follow through, this would be deception. Especially knowing that there were two girls, one of them was supposed to be with Yaakov, one is supposed to be with Esav. If he doesn't marry Rachel, she's probably going to go to Esav. How much aggravation would he cause her? So you want now that Yaakov, because he's Frum and he has to observe the whole Torah before it was given, he should throw Rachel under the bus and not marry her and let her end up with Esav. That Yaakov could not do. The chumrah of Yaakov Avinu not to marry two sisters cannot override the prohibition of deceiving Rachel and causing her so much aggravation. Now everything is understood. He said, I observed the 613 mitzvahs. Im lavan garti v'taryag mitzvahs shamarti. Avram observed all the mitzvahs, even though Avram didn't do a bris before Hashem told him. And Yaakov married the sister. Rashi says, taryag mitzvahs shamarti. Doesn't say taryag mitzvahs kiyamti. I observed the 613. He doesn't say I did the 600. He didn't do all the mitzvahs. He married two sisters. But he observed them. In other words, he wasn't over because the opposite of shmir is when you're over on a mitzvah loisasa or you're mevatel a mitzvah sase. Not if the Torah tells you to be over. Then you're actually being shomer the mitzvahs. Over here by Yaakov marrying two sisters, he was actually observing the Torah that demands of him under those circumstances to follow through with his verbal commitment, because this is the moral obligation. Again, if Hashem would tell him not to marry two sisters, then this overrides anything else, even a verbal commitment. A verbal commitment doesn't have the power to override a prohibition in the Torah. But it was not a prohibition in the Torah. It was a chumrah. Just like pikuach nefesh doicha kol Torah kuli. You don't say, oh, you're over on Torah. No, this is what Torah says. Here too, Torah would say, don't follow your chumrah and marry Rachel. And there's a very powerful lesson. When I want to be stringent, and I want to grow in my spirituality and my Yiddishkeit. It's amazing and beautiful. But the first thing you have to make sure is it shouldn't be at the expense of the needs and the benefit of other people. On the contrary, Hashem says the reason why I love Avram ki yadaitiv lemana sheyitzava es bonav es beis achra v'shamru derech Hashem lasois tzedakah u'mishpat. He says, you know why I love Avram Avinu? It doesn't say because Avram Avinu observed the whole Torah before it was given. Because I know that he's going to tell his children and his grandchildren and his home, and he's going to teach them to follow the path of God, to do tzedakah and mishpat, righteousness and justice. In other words, their tzedakah, their sensitivity, their empathy towards each other. And the tzedakah is going to be in a way of tzedakah or mishpat. What's the connection? The tzedakah itself has to be with a mishpat, which means you have to be able to say, this money I really need for myself, and this money I can give away for tzedakah. Your tzedakah, you should be introspective and be real. Am I doing this? Whatever I'm doing this because I really, really want to be close to God. If you really want to be close to God, then you want to make sure to love God's children, because that's what he wants. If you love God, you love his children. And I have to always be introspective and ask myself, is this maybe an ego trip? Is this maybe an obsessive trip? Is this maybe my OCD? Is this maybe a way of being vindictive, a way of justifying my disdain towards you or my division with you in the name of God? And here religion is used as a crutch to exploit people, to manipulate people. No. You want to be machmer gevaldig, but make sure your chumrah is coming from a place of refinement, of empathy, of oneness with Hashem, of oneness with your soul, and therefore of oneness with humanity, and oneness with the Jewish people, and oneness with your family. This is not about being lightheaded and careless and apathetic and indifferent and just, this nice humanistic approach of moral relativism. No. There are boundaries, there are things that are forbidden and things that are permissible. But then there are those things, where there is gray and you want to go the extra mile, and that's amazing. But I have to ask myself, is this really what Hashem wants from me at this moment? It may sound very holy, it may sound very religious, but maybe the chumrah at this moment is to cook rice on Pesach. Maybe the chumrah at this moment is he made his matzah wet, bite your lips. Maybe the chumrah at this moment is for you to be quiet. Maybe that's the chumrah. Maybe the chumrah for you is not to say anything, not to interfere, to show respect, to show love. It shouldn't come from weakness, it should come from strength. But I have to always ask myself, what does God want from me at this moment? What's the way in which I'm going to achieve real intimacy with Hashem? Have a beautiful and wonderful week. I'm going to take a few questions. If you're on Zoom, you could write the questions on chat. If you are on the yeshiva.net, you can type in the question over there by the video. Okay, on chat I see compliments. Thank you. That's very sweet. Thank you. Thank you from Israel. Okay. How come Yaakov didn't respond to Lavan? You didn't know this 7 years ago? Or how come Yaakov never heard of the custom that the younger doesn't marry before the elder? Didn't Rachel know this practice? Well, it says clearly that when Yaakov met Rachel, he told her that he is her father's brother. So the Gemara asks him about Basra, and Rashi brings it. He wasn't her father's brother. He was her father's nephew. Why did he say he's your father's brother? He was intimating that I am your father's kin. I am your father's sibling, meaning I'm a partner of your father. I know how to deal with your father. He's a deceiver, and I can deal with deceivers. Achiv ani b'ramos. If he wants to deceive me, I'll deceive him. In other words, Rachel warned Yaakov that her father is a drekap. He's not straight. And that's the reason our sages tell us that Yaakov did not recognize that it was lay at night because only in the morning when he saw. Because Rachel gave Yaakov simonim, signs, to be able to identify that she's the right person. In other words, they both knew that Lavan may create a switch, and Yaakov was prepared for that. So he was prepared for this deception. Yet, Rachel gave him simonim, or he gave Rachel simonim, so this shouldn't happen. We know at the last moment, what do our sages say? Rachel gave over those simonim to Leah because she was so afraid for Leah being humiliated. And because of that, what happens is Yaakov ends up with Leah, not with Rachel. So now Yaakov tells Lavan, why did you deceive me? And Lavan gives this answer. Yaakov Avinu, of course, knew that he was a deceiver. Rachel already warned him about it. Okay. We come now to the last point, to the last and final point. At the end of the day, you can ask now a big question. All very nice. It was a chumrah. But nonetheless, the Torah gives a reason why you're not allowed to marry two sisters. Why? V'isha elachoisa loisikach litzrar. When you bring two sisters into a marriage with one man, one sister becomes a source of distress and anxiety for the other sister. You're not allowed to do that. Don't bring them into this bind. It's not fair. Torah doesn't allow it. At the end of the day, it was a chumrah, all's good and fine, but it's something that's going to be forbidden. Why did Yaakov allow himself to do it? So you'll say, well, he made a promise for Rachel, he had to. Okay, very geschmack, he had to. But nonetheless, if this was the situation, perhaps he could have explained it to Rachel, there's going to be a litzra, there's going to be a tzara here, there's going to be a problem here. At the end of the day, with all of the explanations, you're doing something that violates the hashkafa of Torah, even though it was not a prohibition before Matan Torah. So the Rebbe adds one final point, and that is, Yaakov felt, and before Matan Torah he could make this cheshbon, that in this situation the litzror will not apply. Why? When Yaakov ended up with Leah, and then he met Rachel, he probably asked her, what happened with the simonim? I gave you signs. How did Leah know them? And perhaps Rachel had to tell him the truth. I gave them over to Leah. In other words, my sensitivity and my respect for my sister overrided everything. Yaakov Avinu said, if this is my Rachel, there's not going to be a litzrah. If this is my Rachel, even if I marry her and Leah is going to be another sister, is going to be another wife, there's not going to be a litzrah. They're not going to become a source of tzaras for each other. In this home, there will not be a hatred that will turn two loving sisters into foes, into enemies, because they know how to compromise. They know how to forgo their own benefits for the other. If Rachel is capable of such self-sacrifice, there won't be a litzrah in this situation. And indeed, we see two stories. When Leah is giving birth and Rachel is struggling with infertility, it says Rachel was jealous of her sister. So what does Rashi say? Kina b'ma'aseh hatoivim. She was jealous because of her good deeds. In other words, this wasn't a jealousy of, I can't stand my sister, she's happy, she's successful, she's having children, her husband is going to love her, I hate her. No, it's a kina b'ma'aseh hatoivim. I want to learn from Leah. Wow, why does Rashi say this? Say she was jealous. First time you hear about jealousy, because there's no litzrah here. Rachel didn't have that jealousy of Leah. And when Leah begins her seventh pregnancy, remember what happens? Leah is afraid that it's going to be a son, and then Rachel will not even have two, because she knew that Yaakov was going to have 12 sons. She had 6. Bilhah and Zilpah each had 2. So that's 10. If Leah now has a 7th son, it's going to be number 11, so Rachel will not even have 2 sons. In other words, she will have less than the maids, and that perturbs Leah to her core. And what happens? Dana din ba'atzma, she judges herself, and she prays that the fetus should be transformed, and instead of having a son, she has a daughter, and that is Dinah. And that's why the name is Dinah, because she judged herself, how can I allow myself to have a 7th son, and my sister Rachel will not even be able to have 2 sons like Bilhah and Zilpah. Wow. She might say, Rachel is jealous of me, Rachel is closer to Yaakov. Let me have a 7th son, let me show her. No, not these 2 sisters. Even though there was pain and even though there were difficulties, but litzrah, there was no litzrah. Yaakov was right. And therefore the whole logic that the Torah gives why 2 sisters can't marry each other doesn't apply to Leah and Rachel. And therefore Yaakov could marry Leah and Rachel, even though
the Kais Shal Bracha, he won't do when Mashiach comes, because after Matan Torah it's an Isser. But for Yaakov Avinu, it was the right thing, according to Rashi's perspective on Torah.